Alright, greetings and salutations. I've been trying for the last several minutes to get the thumbnail for this video right and everything, and even though they're crappy and all this, I still like the look of them. It makes it feel like I've accomplished something. But anyways, retainers. I brought up in my video last night uh, talking about rumor tables. Uh, I brought up retainers whenever I was talking about the rumor table on B2. And so retainers is kind of one of those mechanics that didn't quite necessarily fall out of the newer editions. Excuse me. But it's not quite the same. Excuse me again. Shoo. Um, Most people, when they have a hireling, it's usually like a DMPC. Um, but that's not the way I run them. Um, I've had groups that have had retainers before, um, but we're going to talk about what exactly a retainer is, um, and why people want them, right? So, retainers, I'm on page 39 of Basic Fantasy RPG's core rules. Uh, Retainers are defined as close associates of the employer. They are hired for a share of treasure, typically 15%. Now, that percentage can go higher. I would say 15 would probably be like the lowest you can do, the bare minimum. If I was if I was running it, and as a game master, I would recommend that being the lowest base amount. Um, and this is at least 15% of the employer's income. So whatever gold gained, whether that's through dungeons or not, they get a share. Plus support costs, weapons, armor, that kind of thing. Um, they're typically very loyal, and they're the only sort of hireling that will accompany a player into a dungeon, uh, or a lair, or a ruin, right? So you also have specialists and mercenaries, but specialists are more for construction, and mercenaries are more for the defense of fortresses and stuff like that. They only really come into the dungeons after it's already been cleared out by the players. Um, so the retainer is actually hired by the PCs, and so the game master has to be involved with the hiring process because this is an NPC that's being plucked out of the world for employment to the character players. Um, the players had to make an attempt to find a retainer, such as hiring a town crier, um, placing notices in the public squares, asking NPCs such as innkeepers and taverners uh, to direct potential retainers to the player characters. Um, Obviously, there's some money involved in all this. Um, but as a game master, it is your job to determine how successful this is. If the if there's a success with finding potential employees, now comes the interviewing process, and so the whole entire time you're making reaction rolls, right? So I'm going to bring out my d6s, and I'm going to help guide along this process, even though you can't see the results of my dice. So use 2d6s for mostly for reaction rolls and morale rolls, but it comes into play here, and it comes into play with a lot of the mechanics surrounding the retainers. So there is a table where you roll 2d6s. Now this is adjusted by the charisma score, bonus or penalty of the player character involved in the interviewing process. And so you roll and you consult it on the table. I rolled a 7, which is a try again, and we'll get to that here in a second. So now on a 2 or less, because obviously if you have a -1 or -2 to your charisma, it's going to make the roll fail. So I rolled a I rolled an 8, which still puts me at try again. But if I would have rolled a 2, and let's say I had a -2, it's 0. So that's defined as a refusal and a -1 on further rolls. So let's define what that is. The rolls define that as what that means is that all further reaction rolls made towards the player character in the given town or region will be a penalty of -1 due to unkind words said by the NPC to his fellows. If the player character tries again in a different town, the penalty does not apply. So this is a local worker. This is a local NPC. And now word has gotten around. So that any kind of potential hirees are going to be very unfavorable for the player. Now, here's try again, which is the next one up, because a refusal is just a flat out refusal. No penalties involved. And that is a 3 to a 5. So I rolled 2 try agains, right? So if a try again result is rolled, the potential retainer is reluctant and now needs more convincing. The player character must sweeten the deal in order to get an additional roll, such as by offering more pay, a magic item, etc. If the player character makes no better offer, then try again is treated as a failure. Now, obviously you have acceptance at 9 through 11. So I just happen to throw a 9 right there. And on a 12 or more, because 12 is the best you can get on 2d6s, right? But obviously with charisma bonuses, it's an acceptance +1 to loyalty. So you get an additional loyalty point. So let's talk about loyalty. All retainers have a loyalty score, which is generally 7 plus the employer's charisma bonus for penalty. The loyalty score is used just as the morale score of monsters or mercenaries is used. We'll get into that mechanic probably in a later video. But if a loyalty check roll is made in combat is a natural 2, the loyalty of the retainer is increased by +1 point. So I want to talk about that real quick. So generally, in basic fantasy RPG, because it's ascending armor class, the higher the rolls, the better when it comes to combat. In terms of skill checks and like thief skills and stuff like that, and morale checks and reaction rolls and stuff like that. Well, actually, reaction rolls is a bad example because, like, obviously the lower ones here on the loyalty table was different, the reaction rolls to the hiring process was different. Lower is terrible here, but generally, the lower the roll, the better. Like on thief skills, so and like on finding a secret door or something. So like, try to find a secret door. Happen to roll a 1, find the secret door. So, it's so just to kind of help newer players that are coming to this. Once you actually run the game, it's not so hard to realize and remember. But, anyways, if a loyalty check roll is made in combat as a natural 2, then the loyalty of the retainer increases by +1 point. I rolled a 6. So that was a loyalty, like it was a good morale check for a 7 loyalty score retainer. If that would have been a 2, not only would it have passed, but his loyalty would have gone up by +1, which would have made it an 8, for example. Note that a loyalty score of 12 is fanatical. This is usually reserved for retainers that have either been here for a while or the player rolled really, really good, had everything go right. The retainer will do virtually, anything the player character asks, and never flee in combat. So never flee in combat, but virtually anything they ask. However, the game master should still apply penalties when the player character instructs the retainer to do something which appears very risky, making a failed check possible. In addition, the game master should roll a loyalty check for each retainer at the end of each adventure after treasure is divided to determine if the retainer will remain with the player character. The GM may apply adjustments to this roll. Probably no more than 2 points, plus or minus, if the retainer is particularly well or poorly paid. So, what defines the end of the adventure? Now, I come from the Gygax school of thought, whereas the end of the adventure is signified by the return to town, because the whole point of the game is dungeon exploration, right? So, dungeon exploration, getting treasure and stuff like that. So when player characters generally go back to town, it usually signifies the end of the session and the end of the adventure for the session. At which point you can apply experience points and divide the treasure and this, that, and everything else. You don't have to divide the treasure right there in the middle of the room, right? So just have somebody carry it until the time being, and then everybody can have their share. But I don't want to stress that, but that's not always the case. Obviously, if the characters think they need something, they need to just go back out to town real quick to go grab it and then come back to the dungeon. Like in the case of Old Island Fortress is not very far from Morgan's Fort, for example, so it's conceivable that they can make that trip back within an hour. So no big deal. But generally, I apply the Gygax school of thought. The return to town is signifying the end of the adventure for the session. Maximum number of retainers. A player character may hire at most 4 retainers, adjusted by the character's charisma bonus or penalty. Any attempts to hire more than this number of retainers will be met with an automatic refusal. So, obviously, you can interpret this how you want. Personally, I interpret it as, like, if you have a +3 on your charisma, you can hire 7. But I can see the case for 4 being the bare maximum. That's fine too. However you want to rule it, that's the correct way. Personally, I think the rule suggests that 7 could be a possibility, but however you want to take it. And obviously the penalties will make that less. Level of retainers. Normally, potential retainers will be 1/2 of the level of the employer or less. So a first level character cannot hire retainers. Second level PCs can only hire first level retainers, and so on. So like a level 3 will only be able to employ level 1 retainers, because 1/2 round down 1. So because there is no 1.5 level, right? So of course there is no way for the retainers to directly know the level of the PC employer, nor for the employer to know the level of the potential retainer. But the game master should usually enforce this rule for purposes of game balance. It shouldn't be surprising that first level characters can't hire retainers, as they have no reputation to speak of yet, and I agree with that ruling. It makes no sense for first level characters to have retainers. It seems improbable from a role playing stance and for a game balance sense. So I do agree with this. Now, of course, you can change this however you want, but I'm personally of that opinion that yes, because when you're level 1, you're Luke Skywalker at the beginning of New Hope. You're starting out on the farm. You haven't got your toes wet yet. So now because we don't want to metagame and we want to keep game balance, how does a level 1 retainer know that the party is level 2? As game master, that should be your responsibility to decide. And in my opinion, like a level 2 will have some kind of reputation. Maybe whispers like, hey, those guys made it pretty far into the Old Island Fortress, for example. Like, they didn't get very far, but they did pretty good. They fairly accomplished. They're not dead. Obviously, if you've been at it for a while and you're living, you're successful. Experience for retainers. Unlike other hired NPCs, retainers do gain experience just as the adventurers do, because specialists and mercenaries don't help with the adventures, right? However, as they are under the command of a player character, only one half of a share of XP is allocated to each retainer. See character advancement below, for example. So we're going to skip down to page 42, specifically where it says, after tallying the XP earned in a given adventure, the amount should be divided by the number of adventures. As described above, each retainer should receive a 1/2 share. So a group of 4 player characters and a retainer is counted as having 4.5 members. If 2,000 XP are earned by this group, 1 share for each PC is 444 XP, and the retainer receives 222. I think when it comes to experience points, whether you round up or round down, that's up to you to do. Because what's the difference between like 94, 93, or 95? You know what I mean? So, like, my personal opinion, round down on everything, but you do you. So, let's talk about why people want retainers, okay? Because this is a character that's not going to grow as fast. Well, number one, more bodies on the field always makes for good meat shield, right? So that's the more obvious one. Having more hands on the plow is better than having less, right? Number two, probably one that doesn't get talked about a lot, except in OSR circles. This is a potential future PC. In case the employer dies, the retainer could become the next player character. Now, this is up to whether the GM wants to rule it that way and whether the player wants to play this character afterwards. That's totally fine too. But in the heat of combat, it's fine to I believe it's fine to hand over the reins to the player and say, here you go, because this is a character with gear, with weapons, with stats already rolled, with hit points already rolled, and they can help finish the battle out and possibly the dungeon. This is all up to how you rule it at your table. My personal opinion, I would use that as a potential future PC. If my players want that character to take that role. I would probably roll to see if that retainer would stay, because I just saw their boss die, which can be I don't know about you, but if my boss dropped dead in front of me, it'd probably shake me a little bit. So let's just say, okay, they need a 7 or lower to stay with the party. They rolled a 6. They stay with the party. So I think it's a good idea, but again, however you want to rule that, right? I think that up to your interpretation, so on and so forth. Because in my personal opinion, character creation is not that long, but in the middle of the session, it's the buying of gear, the starting gear for a character that takes the longest time. Which at my tables, I allow the equipment emporium for the starting packs in the book to be used, and I also use a lot of the supplements that can be found on basicfantasy.org for starting packs, where you just get the starting pack and then you roll 2d6 times 10 for starting gold. So a starting pack, and I just rolled a 9, so 90 gold to start off with. That's not bad. So I recommend that because that helps streamline the process. And then the ways that I would use loyalty. Some situations I probably wouldn't roll at all. Like, let's say the character sends the retainer with a 10-foot pole down the hallway. 10-foot pole is a very useful item. Checking for traps, thumping, and checking for tripwires and pressure plates and this, that, and everything else. And reasonably dangerous because they could be on the wrong side of the tripwire or the pressure plate, but they would feel very safe because you have 15 feet of reach. You have a 5-foot character and 10 feet of pole. So it's reasonable that if they're on the right side of it, they're going to remain unscathed and they're going to be able to find a trap, if not trigger it. So again, that depends on how you roll and what the trap is and this, that, and everything else. But I probably wouldn't roll for that because I think the retainer would find it fairly logical to send him with the one with the 10-foot pole down the hallway. Now, in the case of opening the door that they don't know what's on the other side, I would roll. Now, it's not a guarantee that it's going to be dangerous, but there's always some implied danger. What you can't see is one of the more dangerous parts. And so he rolled a 12. He would not do it at all. He would refuse to open the door. That's the worst roll you could have. Now, let's say somebody scouted ahead and says there's a kobold. Now, that was without penalties, the door thing, by the way. So let's say there's a kobold, a little gang up ahead in the dungeon. Somebody scouts ahead, reports that, and they want somebody to run into the room because kobolds are cowardly and generally rely on traps and tactics because they're cowardly, not fit for fight. Because in this game, I mean, in all games they're pretty low HP, but in this game it's like I think it's a D4 hit die. So like, but anyways, let's send the retainer in there to scream and scare them off. Now, a lot of things has to go right. The kobolds has to have a reaction roll that would determine favorability of that. 9. All right. No way or not, it's possible they could be scared. And then, how does the retainer feel about this? 8. No. Because even with a -1. Well, no. With a 7, yeah, that would probably work. But that would be the one that I would apply the penalty to, a -1 penalty. It's a fairly risky thing. The way to run these things is to remember, first and foremost, these are living, breathing characters within your world. They are not mindless slaves. They have as much interest in self-preservation as the characters do. So when you run retainers, don't run them like a DMPC. In fact, I would suggest not even having them speak unless spoken to. So, and even then, like, within reason. Like, no weird, awkward RP, like, at all. And no Deus Ex Machina stuff whatsoever. Like, this is a normal, regular character. You should treat it just the same as you have players. Now, another reason why I like retainers is because it's one of those brief moments, one of the few times that the characters can tell the GM what to do. Now, there's restrictions to that, and it all comes down to the dice too, and the GM has to rule how successful this is. So, well, Nate wouldn't be successful on a 7 loyalty, but anyway, to get my point, it's one of those few instances, like, because obviously, like, I'm the god of my world. Like, whatever says goes, whether they like it or not. Whatever I rule, that's the ruling. It's concrete. We have this weird, strange fascination nowadays in TTRPG circles where the DM has to be this figure of suggestion, this very fluid figure that's never sturdy and caves in too easily to the whims of the players. What is acceptable, what is not. Now, one of my players brought up something that was because he watched one of my videos in which I talked about the orc children and stuff like that, and the pregnant orcs and stuff like that. And he said, yeah, I watched that, and I wish I hadn't done that, talked about that. In fact, that video is kind of one I sort of have some regrets on about what I talk about, but I brought it up, so it's out there now. Anyways, he brought up, yeah, I watched it. Can we gloss over that scene or something? And like, I find it fairly fairly reasonable, because even though orcs in my world are more akin to demons, and they're not these weird furry kind of characters, I understand the implications of that and why somebody be uncomfortable with that. So the way I'm going to run that, if they ever make it there, is, probably like very much imply that combat doesn't have to be the way out of here. Know what I mean? But I've already said too much on that. But anyways, so the point being, any other time I wouldn't. Like, no, sorry, gotta deal with it, right? So any other time I would just be like, no, sorry, you signed up for this. So, because I'm very much not a do you consent to spiders kind of game master. I'm not. Like, you deal with it or you leave the game. And it's the same, like, for some reason people get triggered by the undead stuff. No, you either deal with it or you leave the game. You leave the table. But I can understand the whole pregnant orc thing to a degree. So, anyways, this one instance of having a retainer is in which it's the autonomy of the player versus the autonomy of an NPC controlled by the game master. Now, the game master runs this character like a thinking, breathing individual who will make competent combat decisions in the heat of battle and will seek to run away if they have no other choice. Unless in the case of having a 12, in which they will stand and fight as long as their boss does. But continuing on, it's like I said, it all comes down to chance, but it's one of those few instances in which a player can somewhat tell the GM what to do. You know what I mean? You're not, as GM, you're not relinquishing your control, but you are giving them reins to drive a little bit. It's kind of like when your dad, I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid, my dad would sit me in his lap and let me drive his truck. I'd have the steering wheel. So it's one of those few instances in which somebody who is in authority gives somebody who is not the opportunity to control a situation. That doesn't happen a whole lot. There's very few instances in which the players have control, and for good reason. It's not GM versus player. It's GM brings a world. I, as a game master, want to see my players succeed, but I also have to be a fair and impartial referee. If I fudge the dice rolls and I tilt the odds in their favor, then not only have I broken that suspension of disbelief, but I've also failed at my job as a game master. My job as a game master is not to make sure your character death makes narrative sense. My job as a game master is not to make sure that you live through the goblin encounter just so you can fight the dragon at the end. That's not my job. And if the random encounter table says you get a black dragon, you get a black dragon. That's just the way it is. But it's one of those things that within reason, keep in mind, within reason. So, I've said all I'm going to say on this subject because I'm already rambling on. Thanks for listening to me drone on for about a half hour. Next video I plan on doing is the usefulness of daggers, because a dagger is a very underutilized, underrated tool, and it was something I was talking about when I was talking about retainers in B2. So, anyway, as always, guys, take care. God bless. See you on the other side.